What if I told you that there may have once been an empire so massive, so advanced, and so mysterious, that it covered nearly the entire world? An empire with shining cities, breathtaking buildings, and technology that we can hardly explain even today. And yet, this empire is not in your history books. You were never taught about it in school. In fact, almost no one has ever heard of it. Why? Because some believe it was deliberately erased, buried under lies, destroyed by disasters, and hidden in plain sight. This is the story of Tartaria, a lost civilization, whispered about on old maps, hinted at in strange architecture, and remembered in fragments of forgotten history. Some call it a myth. Others believe it is the greatest cover-up in human history. In this video, we're going to peel back the layers of mystery. We'll look at the maps that show Tartaria as a mighty empire, the buildings that don't seem to belong to their time, the mud flood theory that claims cities were buried overnight, and the strange possibility of free energy technology hidden long ago. Was Tartaria real? Or is it just a story created to fill the gaps of our past? The truth may be stranger than anything you've ever imagined. So get ready, because once you start asking questions about Tartaria, history will never look the same again. What is Tartaria? Full narration. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is Tartaria? If you search through your school history books, you won't find much, if anything, about it. But if you go back and look at maps from the 16th, 17th, and even 18th centuries, you'll notice something strange. In the place we know today as Russia, Central Asia, and parts of Siberia, there is a massive area labeled Tartary or Grand Tartaria. It's not a small region, it stretches across thousands of miles. The people living there were called Tartars by European mapmakers, and for centuries, this land was recognized as a real place. Travelers, explorers, and merchants wrote about it. But here's the mystery. As time went on, this name disappeared. By the 19th century, Tartaria was gone from the maps. No empire, no kingdom, not even a mention in most modern history books. It was as if the entire region and its people had been erased. Some historians argue that Tartary was never really a single empire. It was just a word used by Europeans for unknown lands in Asia. They claim it was more of a label than a true country. But others disagree. Conspiracy researchers and alternative historians suggest that Tartaria was not just a vague region, it was a powerful civilization, maybe even more advanced than we imagine. They point to the size of the area, the old maps that show Tartaria as one large entity, and the fact that very little detailed history has survived about this supposed empire. Why would an entire region so large simply vanish from human memory? Was it swallowed up by other nations? Or was it deliberately erased from history? This is where the mystery deepens. Because if Tartaria was real, then everything we know about the timeline of civilization might be wrong. It would mean there was once a global power, maybe even a worldwide empire, that controlled vast territories, developed advanced architecture, and possibly even discovered technologies that we still struggle to explain today. And the most shocking part? Evidence of this so-called Tartarian empire may still be around us, hiding in plain sight, in the buildings we walk past every day, in the buried cities beneath our feet, and in the maps that history quietly forgot. Asterisk. The mystery of the maps, full narration. If Tartaria really existed, one of the strongest pieces of evidence comes from something we can all see for ourselves: old maps. When we look at maps made by European explorers between the 1500s and 1700s, Tartaria is clearly marked. Not just as a small place, but as a massive region. Some maps even label it Grand Tartary, stretching across what is today Russia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Siberia, and beyond. In some cases, it looks larger than Europe itself. Now here's the question: why would mapmakers, trained professionals trusted by kings and governments, draw an empire that didn't exist? Cartography was serious business back then. Maps weren't just for decoration, they were tools of navigation, trade, and war. If Tartaria was simply a mistake or a blank space, why did it appear so consistently across hundreds of maps? Historians today usually explain it this way: The word Tartary wasn't the name of a single empire. It was more of a catch-all label. Europeans didn't fully understand the lands of Central Asia, so they used Tartary to describe all of it, from Siberia to Mongolia. In other words, it was a vague placeholder, not a real nation. But conspiracy researchers aren't convinced. They point out that some maps show detailed divisions inside Tartaria, like regions and cities, as if cartographers had specific knowledge of its lands. There are even old atlases that describe the people of Tartary, their customs, and their rulers. That doesn't sound like a random label. It sounds like someone was describing an actual empire. Even more puzzling, the name Tartary starts to disappear in the 1800s. By the mid-19th century, the term is gone. Instead, the maps show Russia expanding across those lands, and Tartaria is nowhere to be found. Almost as if it was erased. This sudden disappearance raises big questions. Did the Russian Empire and other rising powers take over Tartaria and wipe out its memory? Or was there a deliberate effort to remove it from history books, as if someone wanted us to forget it ever existed? Think about it. If Tartaria was a powerful civilization with advanced knowledge, its very existence would challenge the story of human progress we're taught today. It would suggest that history is not a straight line from primitive caves to modern skyscrapers, but something far more complicated, maybe with entire chapters torn out. And here's the strangest part. Some of those maps still exist in museums and libraries today, yet very few people ever talk about them. They sit quietly in archives, holding a secret that might change everything we think we know about the past. Asterisk. The architecture puzzle, full narration. If maps raise the first questions about Tartaria, the architecture raises even bigger ones. Take a walk through almost any major city in the world: Paris, London, Moscow, St. Petersburg, New York, even Delhi, and you'll notice something strange. Among the modern glass towers and busy streets, there are old buildings that seem almost out of place. Gigantic stone structures with towering columns, massive arches, domes, and spires that look more like they belong in a fairy tale than in the 1800s. Historians usually explain these as examples of European styles like neoclassical, Baroque, or Renaissance revival. They say these were built in the 18th and 19th centuries as part of city expansions. But here's the mystery: how were they built so fast, with such precision, at a time when people supposedly only had horse-drawn carts, primitive cranes, and basic tools? Some of these buildings are enormous: railway stations the size of palaces, government halls with ceilings so high they could fit an entire modern skyscraper inside, cathedrals with intricate carvings and stained glass that would take decades, maybe centuries, to complete. Yet we're told many of them were constructed in just a few years. Does that really make sense? Conspiracy researchers argue that these buildings weren't built by the nations we're told. Instead, they were inherited. In other words, they were already here, remnants of Tartaria. When the old empires supposedly vanished, the new rulers simply took over the buildings, cleaned them up, and claimed them as their own. This theory gets even more interesting when you look closely at the details. Many of these buildings have unusual features that don't seem to serve any purpose: metal domes, tall spires, strange antenna-like shapes, and geometric patterns. Some believe these weren't just decoration, but part of an old technology system, perhaps designed to capture and transmit free energy from the atmosphere. Think about it. Why do so many old-world buildings look like giant electrical devices? Domes like batteries, spires like lightning rods, grids of windows and arches like circuits? Is it possible they were designed to harness natural forces we don't fully understand anymore? There's also the question of global similarity. How is it that buildings in Russia look eerily similar to those in America, Europe, and Asia, even though they were supposedly built by completely different cultures around the same time? Did they all just happen to copy the same style? Or were they part of one global civilization, Tartaria, that left its mark everywhere? And then there's the strangest detail of all: the World's Fairs of the 19th century. These events showcased massive, ornate, temporary buildings said to be built just for the fairs and then demolished. But when you look at the photos, these so-called temporary buildings look just as advanced and permanent as the great cathedrals and government halls. Were they really built just for show? Or were they already standing structures, remnants of Tartarian cities, repurposed and then destroyed to erase the evidence? The architecture puzzle leaves us with a haunting thought. Maybe humanity didn't build all of these grand structures from scratch. Maybe we simply inherited them from a lost empire whose knowledge of building and energy was far beyond what we give them credit for. And if that's true, then the cities we live in today are not just modern creations, they're graveyards of a forgotten civilization. Asterisk. The architecture of Tartaria, an advanced civilization hidden in plain sight. When people first hear about Tartaria, many dismiss it as nothing more than a conspiracy theory. But when we start looking closely at the architecture left behind, things begin to feel less like myth and more like mystery. Across the world, we see grand, monumental buildings, palaces, cathedrals, railway stations, and government halls that look far too advanced for the era in which they were supposedly built. This section uncovers why architecture is considered one of the strongest pieces of evidence pointing towards Tartaria's existence. 1. The mystery of impossible buildings. Take a moment to think about the St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, or the massive railway stations of the 19th century in Europe and America. These structures are not just decorative, they are immense feats of engineering. Official history often tells us they were built in the 18th or 19th century by workers with basic tools, horse-drawn carts, and limited technology. But how could these massive stone blocks, intricate domes, and giant steel frameworks have been raised without the advanced machinery we rely on today? Some researchers suggest that these buildings were not constructed in the 1800s, but rather inherited from an earlier, advanced civilization, Tartaria. 2. The puzzle of World's Fairs. The World's Fairs of the late 19th and early 20th century add another strange twist. Cities like Chicago, Paris, and San Francisco showcased entire complexes of monumental architecture, grand white domes, columns, and palaces. According to history, these were temporary buildings, constructed for the fairs and then torn down. But eyewitnesses at the time described them as made of solid stone and concrete, not flimsy plaster. Why would entire cities of architectural marvels be built, only to be destroyed? Some theorists argue these weren't temporary constructions at all. They were remnants of Tartarian architecture, rebranded and later demolished to hide their origin. 3. The global, Tartarian style. Here's another curiosity. Buildings in Russia, Europe, Asia, and even the Americas share architectural similarities. Grand arches, onion domes, spires, intricate carvings. How could cultures separated by vast oceans develop the same style independently? Mainstream historians explain this as influence or colonial transfer of ideas. But Tartaria researchers claim it points to a global civilization that once stretched across continents, leaving its architectural fingerprint everywhere. 4. Mud flood buildings buried in plain sight. One of the most striking architectural anomalies connected to Tartaria is the phenomenon of mud flood buildings. Around the world, we see old structures with their first floors buried underground, windows and doors leading nowhere, partially submerged facades. Why would anyone design a building with doors below ground level? Some believe a catastrophic mud flood event in the 18th or 19th century buried much of Tartaria's architecture, literally hiding it beneath layers of earth. What we see today are only the top portions of much larger, older structures. 5. Forgotten technology in architecture. Another baffling detail lies in the design itself. Many of these grand Tartarian-style buildings include features like massive domes and spires that resemble antennae, star forts with geometric precision that suggest advanced engineering, intricate ventilation systems and acoustic designs that modern engineers still struggle to replicate. Some theorists argue these buildings weren't just decorative. They may have been part of an ancient energy grid, harnessing and distributing natural power across Tartaria. 6. Rewriting the builders. Finally, we must ask, if these buildings truly belonged to Tartaria, why were they credited to 18th and 19th century rulers and architects? Many suspect that after Tartaria's collapse, new governments and empires claimed the glory, rewriting history to erase the real origin. The phrase, "history is written by the victors," could not apply more strongly here. If Tartaria was systematically erased, the architecture that remains might be the only surviving proof of its existence. The Great Mud Flood, a global catastrophe or historical deception. If there's one element that truly sets the Tartaria theory apart from all other alternative histories, it's the mysterious event known as the Mud Flood. This idea claims that at some point in the not-so-distant past, perhaps in the 1700s or early 1800s, a catastrophic flood of mud swept across entire regions of the world, burying buildings, infrastructure, and possibly even whole cities. Mainstream history is silent on such an event, yet the physical evidence, some argue, is right beneath our feet. 1. Buried buildings everywhere. Walk around old European cities like Moscow, Prague, or Paris, and you'll notice something strange. Many historic buildings have their ground floors underground. Windows sit below street level, doors open into basements, and entire stories are hidden beneath the soil. If this were just a rare architectural quirk, it could be dismissed. But we see the same pattern in North America, South America, Asia, and even Australia. Why would builders all over the world design structures with basements that look like they were never intended to be underground? For mud flood theorists, the answer is simple. These were not basements at all. They were originally ground-level floors, later buried by a global mud disaster. 2. The timeline problem. Official records don't mention a global mud catastrophe in the last few centuries. So, how do believers explain it? Some argue the event was deliberately erased from history, just like Tartaria itself. Others believe it was rebranded as urban development, streets raised over time, layers of soil added for new construction. But skeptics ask, can so many buildings across continents really be explained by gradual urban changes? Or are we looking at the remnants of a forgotten catastrophe that the powers of the time chose to conceal? 3. Geological explanations, or lack thereof. Geologists and historians generally dismiss the mud flood theory, pointing to natural soil buildup, erosion, or city planning changes as explanations. Yet, there's little to no mainstream research into why so many buildings show this same pattern. Why hasn't science investigated the possibility of a sudden, large-scale mud event? Could it be that even asking the question threatens to unravel accepted history? 4. Survivors and a reset civilization. One of the more controversial claims tied to the mud flood is that it reset humanity's progress. Some theorists suggest much of Tartaria's population perished in the disaster, and those who survived were absorbed into rising empires like Russia, Britain, and America. This may explain why so many grand Tartarian buildings were later attributed to 18th and 19th century rulers. The survivors had no choice but to adapt, while the victors rewrote history. 5. Evidence in old maps and photos. Old maps sometimes show entire cities that no longer exist, while photographs from the 1800s reveal deserted streets with massive empty buildings. Who built them? Where did the original inhabitants go? And why do so many images show signs of excavation, as those cities were being dug out of the earth? Some even point to the star forts, geometric fortresses found worldwide, as having been partially buried, suggesting they were much taller before the mud flood engulfed them. 6. The mud flood and the cover-up. If the mud flood really happened, why cover it up? The theory goes like this. If people knew that advanced civilizations once thrived, and then were suddenly wiped out, it would challenge the entire narrative of human progress. By erasing Tartaria and explaining away the mud flood, the victors established themselves as the sole inheritors of civilization, the erased history and the victor's narrative. History, as we know it, is written by the victors. And if Tartaria truly existed, then the story of its fall, and its complete erasure, was carefully crafted by those who came after. Think about it, the 18th and 19th centuries were a time of enormous empire building. Britain, France, Russia, Spain, and later the United States. These powers were expanding rapidly, claiming lands, rewriting borders, and spreading their own version of history. If Tartaria stood in their way, or if its existence challenged their claim to power, then wiping it off the record would have been the easiest path forward. But how do you erase an entire civilization? You can't just destroy every building. You can't burn every map. The answer is far simpler. You rewrite the story. You take the grand structures of Tartaria and call them cathedrals, parliament buildings, government halls. You rename cities. You relabel maps. And you teach every generation a version of history where Tartaria never existed in the first place. This is why many researchers believe that so much of the 1800s was a massive cover-up operation. School books were rewritten, timelines adjusted, and a new narrative created that showed Europe as the center of progress and America as the land of new beginnings. Meanwhile, the memory of a once great empire was pushed into obscurity. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into hidden history, make sure to subscribe right now, because we'll keep uncovering mysteries that mainstream history prefers to ignore. Now, back to Tartaria. When we study old world photos, there's another curious detail. We see empty cities, streets with no people, but full of magnificent buildings. Who lived in them? Why are they deserted? Some believe that much of the population was wiped out during the mud flood, leaving behind ghost cities that were later repopulated by new settlers. Others think people were relocated, and their identities erased, so the victors could start fresh with a rewritten history. Then there are the strange World's Fairs of the 19th century. Many suspect these weren't built as temporary exhibits at all, but were already existing Tartarian cities, repurposed, showcased for a moment, and then demolished to hide the truth. If that's the case, then entire urban centers of Tartaria were destroyed in plain sight, disguised as temporary spectacles. The erasure wasn't just physical, it was psychological. If a civilization could build structures that captured free energy, if it had advanced technologies we've since forgotten, then admitting Tartaria existed would mean admitting that our current history is a lie. And so, the victors wrote a safer story, one where human progress was slow, linear, and controlled by the very empires we still recognize today. Asterisk. The technology of Tartaria. We often think of advanced technology as something only the modern world has created. Smartphones, airplanes, satellites. These seem like the peak of human progress. But what if we're not the most advanced civilization at all? What if Tartaria, the so-called lost empire, had technologies that were different from ours, maybe even better in some ways? One of the most common claims is that Tartarians knew how to harness free energy. Look at their buildings, massive domes, tall spires, and metal ornaments shaped like antennas. Were these just decoration? Or could they have been part of an energy system, pulling power straight from the atmosphere, like Nikola Tesla dreamed of in the 1900s? Some researchers suggest that these buildings acted like giant energy collectors. The domes may have stored energy, while the spires transmitted it across distances. If true, this would mean Tartaria had clean, wireless power long before we ever discovered electricity in our textbooks. Imagine a world where no one paid for gas, coal, or oil, because energy was free and everywhere. Then there's the strange case of the star forts found all around the world. These massive geometric fortresses, built in shapes of stars with perfect angles, are said to be military structures. But some believe their design was actually functional, channeling natural energy through their shapes. Could star forts have been ancient power stations rather than just defenses? Transportation is another mystery. If Tartarians had access to free energy, did they also build advanced machines, airships, magnetic railways, or other forms of travel we've lost today? Old photographs from the 19th century sometimes show strange airship-like objects in the sky, which fueled the idea that people of the time still had leftover Tartarian technology. Even water systems raise questions. Many old Tartarian-style buildings are built with underground chambers, strange piping, and fountain systems that seem far too advanced for the time. Were these simply clever plumbing designs? Or something more, like water-based energy systems we no longer understand? And here's the most fascinating part. If Tartaria really mastered free energy, then its fall makes more sense. Modern empires built their power and wealth on controlling resources: coal, oil, electricity. If a civilization already had technology that made those things unnecessary, then allowing it to survive would threaten the entire economic order. Wiping out Tartaria and hiding its technology would mean rewriting the rules of the world in favor of the victors. So the big question is, were these just beautiful buildings, or were they the last remnants of a forgotten technology? One that could change everything we know about history, science, and even our future? Asterisk. Why Tartaria matters today. At this point, you might be wondering, why does Tartaria matter? Even if it did exist, what difference does it make to us today? The answer is simple, because history shapes who we are. If a massive, advanced empire really thrived just a few centuries ago, and was deliberately erased, then everything we know about human progress might be wrong. Think about it. We're taught that humanity struggled slowly, step by step, from the Dark Ages to the Industrial Revolution, and finally into the modern world. But what if there was another path? What if people once lived in beautiful cities powered by free energy, connected across continents, with technology that didn't destroy the planet? This changes more than just history, it changes our future. If Tartaria had clean, free energy, why can't we? If they built structures designed to last centuries, why do our buildings crumble in decades? If they lived in harmony with natural forces, what lessons could we learn for the challenges we face today, like climate change, pollution, and energy crises? There's also a bigger issue, trust. If history can be rewritten once, who's to say it hasn't been rewritten many times? Who decides what is taught in schools, what is hidden in archives, and what is shown in museums? If Tartaria was erased, then it's proof that powerful groups can shape the story of humanity to suit their own needs. And maybe that's the real lesson of Tartaria, not just the possibility of free energy or lost cities, but the reminder to question, to look closer, and to never take official history at face value. Because the truth is often stranger, richer, and more mysterious than the version we're handed in textbooks. So, whether Tartaria was a vast forgotten empire, a mix of misunderstood history, or something in between, one thing is clear: exploring its mystery opens our eyes. It forces us to ask hard questions. What else has been hidden? What else have we inherited without realizing it? And what other secrets are waiting, just beneath the surface of our world, for us to uncover? Asterisk. Tartaria, the Forgotten Empire. We've traveled through maps, architecture, mud floods, and mysteries of lost technology. And while we may never have all the answers, one truth remains clear: the story of Tartaria forces us to think differently about history. Maybe it was a real empire, wiped from memory by the victors. Maybe it was a mix of myths, half-truths, and misunderstood events. Or maybe it was something even bigger, something that connects humanity in ways we've only begun to imagine. But here's the real question: if Tartaria could be hidden from us, what else might still be out there, waiting to be uncovered? The past is not as certain as we think, and the deeper we dig, the more mysteries we find. So, what do you believe? Was Tartaria a lost civilization, or just a story woven from scattered clues? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your theories. And if you enjoyed this journey into hidden history, make sure to like this video, share it with others who love mysteries, and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the secrets of our past.